Now, if the science is correct, and we have no reason, some people have reason to doubt the science, but we have no reason, many of us have no reason to doubt the science. Many countries in the world in the next 20, 30, 40 years, vast parts of them may become uninhabitable, and therefore people will move in vast scales. How worried are you about this threat of climate change being a threat multiplier?
Well, the International Organization for Migration has been concerned with the issue since the 1970s. We published our first volumes in the early 1970s. We continue to be concerned. Look, we're not scientists either, but we have to look around and see what's happening in the world. When I was in Nigeria in the 1990s, I took a fly low, fly slow flight over the whole boundary of Nigeria, a very large country. And when we got over Lake Chad, people were already building permanent settlements in the lake itself because the lake was gone. And that's already 20 years ago. So if you look back at last year, there were more than 300 humanitarian disasters related to natural causes affecting the lives of about 300 million people. 42 million people were displaced last year through climate change or environmental degradation, whatever you want to call it, type events. Now, we believe that to be climate-induced migration. So we have to start preparing for that, and I'd be happy to talk to you about what we're doing.
Absolutely. I was just going to mention first the example of Libya earlier on this year, which perhaps was interesting from a European perspective because you saw frictions emerge between Italy and France, and you saw perhaps a sign of times to come. The fact that Europe, perhaps, where you might be able to tell us better, was not prepared to cope, was not able to cope with vast number of refugees coming onto its shores.
You're absolutely right. Look, when Libya broke in the early part of the year, there were close to 2 million migrant workers inside Libya, about 1 million alone just from Egypt. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and I, as head of our organization, we put our forces together, our resources and our people, and started doing an evacuation and repatriation of the migrant workers. The European public discourse on this felt that they were all coming north. We knew they weren't going north, but we also knew that we had to move them from the congested border areas. So we picked them up at the border, we put them in tents, we fed them, we medically examined them, and we put every one of them on a plane going home. Now to date, and we're still working in the southern Libyan desert, to date there are about 250,000 migrants who've been sent home, more than half of them to sub-Saharan Africa. Now the total number that actually went north was fewer than 50,000. So a lot of the hysteria that was in the public discourse was basically not very well founded. We've spent $125 million, about maybe 700 charter flights. We did at least 20 sea evacuations from Benghazi to Misrata and Benghazi to Libya, to Tripoli in Libya, and took them out by way of either Tunisia or Egypt. Now, what this tells you is that there is a lot of concern. People see a threat to their personal identity or to their national identity. Who are these people? Where are they coming from? Rather than recognizing that with the demographic trends, the digital revolution, distant shrinking technology, the disasters that come from climate change, and the desire of people to chase their dreams and follow their ambitions, there's going to be large-scale migration for much of the rest of the century. So we can either hide from that reality, or we can recognize it and say, how can we develop a policy to deal with it? And part of that policy, and I'm glad to have this interview, because part of that policy is getting the word out there about the realities, and that historically, over many years, I think of the UNHCR poster, Einstein was a refugee. Well, overwhelmingly, historically, migration has been overwhelmingly positive. So today, there are 3 facts about migration. Number one, large-scale migration is inevitable, given the demography we know about. a youthful society in the South without jobs, an aging society in the North with plenty of jobs. It is necessary if we're going to fill those jobs, and if it's managed correctly, it's going to be highly desirable. But I noticed that there was at one point a willingness even to put into consideration and a temporary suspension of Schengen because of the fear of migrants coming north. But it was not well founded.
Does your organisation have the capacity to deal with more than one Libya a year? I mean, do you look at what's been happening in the Horn of Africa as well, and the potential for, if this were to happen more and more over the next 10, 20 years, do you have the capacity to deal with more, and what more would you be looking for from donor countries and donor states?
Well, that's a key question. I mean, how do you deal with multiple complex emergencies? I mean, look, when Libya happened, Cote d'Ivoire had already broken. We had the famine developing in the Horn of Africa. There was the question of what was going to happen in the Arab Spring and other countries, and it clearly outstrips the capacity of all of us. There's such a thing as donor capacity and donor fatigue. So I think we have to widen the circle of those who are prepared to assist. We have never thought that we could do any of these crises alone, which is why the High Commissioner and I decided to do the Libyan crisis together. But clearly we will all be outstripped. One of the three priorities that we're working on right now is partnerships. We have to have more partners, and we're constantly looking for both traditional and non-traditional partners. And we discovered something interesting in Libya, that you have to ask even the most vulnerable and poorest countries to do something. One country, I won't name which one, gave us $30,000. It was nothing, but it was everything. Because you could then go to the other traditional donors and say, look, here's a country that has nothing and is giving of its own. And that really spoke volumes at the time.
Well, it's an appropriate way to move on from countries who don't have a lot, giving a lot, to the negotiations here.
That's right.
How integrated is migration in these negotiations? How many mentions? I'm not sure how here in Durban. I'm not sure how closely you've been following the negotiations, but it strikes me that migration hasn't featured largely. I mean, doesn't more need to be made about it?
Yeah. Look, I'm a newcomer to the field of migration. I've had a couple of careers before this, but I'm very committed to migration. And I'd have to say that I'm disappointed. I was at Copenhagen, I was at Cancun last year, and I'm here today. It was only in Cancun was the first time that large-scale population displacement was actually mentioned in paragraph 14F, the first time, after all these years of talking about climate change and its effects. What is more significant about climate change than people? And so I'm pleased to see it's beginning to be discussed, but I have to tell you, it's very hard in the Millennium Development Goals put together in the year 2000. There's no mention of migration or population displacement. I'm not criticizing, I'm verifying. But I think we have to do a better job of recognizing that the real problem, the most fundamental problem, is that people are going to be displaced in massive numbers. I mean, I can't give you statistics because the statistics they give me are somewhere between 25 million and a billion, which is not a statistic at all. That's a guess. But it will be significant.
And how do you get more agencies working together? It seems even on the UN scale, a lot of agencies are doing similar roles, but how do you get them to work more closely together and work with you in this field?
Well, I think we've made a lot of progress. I give a lot of credit to the UN. UN is our closest partner. We're not part of the UN, but we're kind of like a distant cousin. We work very closely with them. You have two things that have happened. In 2006, at the UN General Assembly, there was the first high-level dialogue on migration and development. There'll be another one in 2013. That put together something called the Global Forum on Migration and Development. It met in Brussels, the next year it met in Manila, then it met in Athens, it met last year in Puerto Vallarta in Mexico, and it's just finished meeting in Switzerland, and will meet next year in Africa in Mauritius. Now, this past year, that brought together 166 countries to deal with this question, both the challenges and the opportunities of migration. So I'm very encouraged by that. There's also another group that was created by the UN Secretary General called the Global Migration Group that brings together 15 UN agencies and IOM as a non-UN agency. 16 of us, we've just met in Paris in November. We've come out with several volumes on the human rights of migrants, on mainstreaming migration into national development plans. So there's a lot of good work being done there. And in addition, we have 16 regional consultative processes around the world bringing countries together to talk about concerns before they become political issues. So I'm encouraged by all of that.
Okay, and I guess a final one, fairly straightforward, but you're in Durban, you've just arrived. Who are you going to meet and what are you going to be telling them?
Well, my role is a very is extremely modest one. I'm here because I think the International Organization for Migration needs to be here. I think it needs to be represented at the most senior level possible. So I'm here for that. I will be making a very brief intervention tomorrow just to get our views on the record. I will hope to see as many people as possible in a sort of a Davos style, walking the corridors, meeting who I can and doing bilaterals. But I'm extremely pleased to be here and delighted that IOM can be part of this, because I do think that migration is an issue. It's a mega trend of our century.